The second reading continues with the first chapter of the book of Exodus, picking up with the 15th verse. The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah and the other Puah, "When you act as midwives to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it is a boy, kill him. But if it is a girl, she shall live." But the midwives feared God. They did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but they let the boys live. So the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and said to them, "Why have you done this and allowed the boys to live?" The midwives said to Pharaoh, "Because the Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes to them." So God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and became very strong. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families. Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, "Every boy that is born to the Hebrews you shall throw into the Nile, but you shall let every girl live." Now a man from the house of Levi went and married a Levite woman. The woman conceived and bore a son. And when she saw that he was a fine baby, she hid him 3 months. When she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him and plastered it with bitumen and pitch. She put the child in it and placed it among the reeds on the bank of the river. His sister stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. May God's blessing continue to flow through the experiences of Scripture. May it guide the meditations of our hearts and the words of my lips on this day. Do we remember the movie Willow? Great movie. Our girls are old enough now, we're going to let them watch it. Val Kilmer and, I can't remember any of the other folks that were in it, and he's not even the main actor, but anyway. It's a great film. And there's a scene in the film where there is a village of folks and there is a master magician who's going to see if he gets to have an apprentice this year to train. And he gathers the potential candidates, the potential sorcerers, apprentices, and holds up a hand and says, "Forget all you know or think you know. All that you require is your intuition. Now the power to control the world is in which finger?" The magician, the sorcerer, holds up a hand and sort of wiggles his fingers, and they all have to choose which finger controls or has the power to control the world. We have been involved in a series that has been built around women of faith. This story is often pointed to as the beginning of the Moses story, but there's women of faith that are in this story, and that's where I want to focus our attention on this day. And so what if I were to tell you, as a person of faith, that what you did today, what you do on this day or on this week, would change the world? What finger has that power? I mean, would you believe me? Would you believe when I stood here earnestly and said, "You can change the world," not in a sort of motivational speaker kind of way? Shy away from that. What if I mean, could you imagine it? If I were to say it with such, feeling. If I was able to say it in such a way that you would begin to believe and have faith that you are capable of changing the world in this week, or would you just sort of secretly smile and politely nod your head and say, "Well, everyone's going to miss a sermon every once in a while. This is David's." The choices that we go on to make, large or small, be they seemingly that way or not, impact creation. You might have heard the term butterfly effect. I mean, breathing in and of itself, breathing, that animating spirit of God going in and out, impacts creation. What finger, as the sorcerer holds up? Well, there were women in these scripture texts that impacted all of creation. The focus might be on the two Hebrew midwives as they are described. They make a decision, they take a chance, and they change the world. Now, it was a small gesture in some ways, the way that they did things, and yet it is so massive in the way that we understand who we are and our identity that we still tell the story. Their names were even recorded, and we know that Scripture is not always good about recording people's names, especially the names of women. And perhaps the women were even more spectacular than we realized, because the Hebrew doesn't say for certain that they were Hebrew. That doesn't make sense. The Scripture text, Hebrew, doesn't say for certain that the women were children of Israel. It could be read that they were those who served the people Israel. These might not even have been Jewish women, but we generally believe that they are. That these midwives who were commanded to destroy life in some serious way chose differently. And if they weren't even part of the community, imagine how much more of a choice that was, of a stepping out on faith it would be. Because it's easy to write off people that aren't like us, to ignore them. But we are told that these women feared. They had faith. They had hope in things unseen. And that sort of internal fortitude, that gift of the Spirit, impacts actions and changes the world. Which finger has that power? The beginning of the book of Exodus itself begins with two words in Hebrew that are powerful for us. A new king arose is the English translation. A ruler who, wishing to solidify their political base, identified a common enemy, a scapegoat, to blame for whatever the current problems were. Talking Exodus now. Pharaoh, who has conveniently forgotten that for generations the Israelites had been around and been part of Egyptian society, had been, well, active participants in culture. He names them as possible terrorists, even though they had once been honored guests. Pharaoh applies an identity to the descendants of Leah and Rachel, the descendants of Bilhah and Zilpah. We often talk about them being the children of Israel, but there were women involved. That's how biology works, right? Pharaoh did not know, did not fear, and that is being held up against these midwives who are not the only women active in the story. Pharaoh doesn't know who these people are, right? So Pharaoh is going to create an identity for them, is going to make claims about who they are. And because of those claims, Pharaoh believes that he can order these two women of faith to do things. Because Pharaoh believes certain truths about women, and I say truths because it's small t what the Pharaoh believes, right? Certain things about women, and because Pharaoh believes certain things about Hebrews, the people of Israel, the Jews that had settled in Egypt. So Pharaoh believes that his finger has the power to control. He believes he can choose the correct one. So he applies an identity. He uses animal language to describe, to dehumanize, to set aside this group, this population that has been part of life in Egypt for hundreds of years at this point. Could we describe ourselves? Can we describe our own identity? Are we full of a vigorous enough faith to be able to stand up against an outside group saying this is who you are and what you should do and be? I mean, Exodus is a story of identity in this way, of us trying to figure it out, of the people of Israel trying to figure it out. And this is who we are. And Pharaoh says, no, this is who you are. And the women who are saying, this is who we are. The things we do this week, our actions, our choices are going to have consequences. For good and for ill, for the health and for the damage of the world, our actions will make a difference. The actions of these women make a difference. And they respond to Pharaoh. They respond to Pharaoh in the same language that he uses. This is a dangerous sort of game to play when you use someone else's identity language. Pharaoh says these people, Israel, are animals. They're criminals. They're outsiders. They don't belong in this place. They might rise up against us. They might be disloyal enemies of the state. And the women say, the Hebrew midwives say, the Jewish women are vigorous. They use animal language, the same language that Pharaoh uses. The women are vigorous. And Pharaoh goes, yeah, they are. They're animals. And the Hebrew midwives say they're not like Egyptian women who are delicate and need all the help in the world. And Pharaoh goes, yeah, those Egyptian women are fantastic. So the midwives are using Pharaoh's words against Pharaoh. And they are changing the world. Their faith is causing a ripple to go out. They refuse the command to sacrifice children, to separate or incarcerate and to execute through the waters of the Nile. And in the Exodus story, God is moving in this irony as the children of Israel are rescued through the same waters. Not the Nile River itself, but through the waters. All those years ago. Perhaps it's easier for us to be brave or vigorous in our faith when we know how things are going to end. I could be faithful like the midwives because I know Moses is coming. We know how things are going to end, so we can be vigorous and faithful. We don't have to shy away or hold our tongue or not do the things because we know how it's going to end. Now, the women should have been figured out. The Hebrew midwives should have been figured out pretty easily. But Pharaoh's concept of identity that he has placed on them, he believes they're less human. He has decided that they are incapable of subterfuge, incapable of disobeying, incapable of doing acts that are profoundly God. Because they're women. And they might be Hebrew. he underestimates the power of faith and how dangerous hope can be when a people feel it in their hearts. Pharaoh doesn't know the people. Doesn't know. Pharaoh doesn't think they're even human. They're animals. And then a child is born. A precious child born, set aside, placed in an ark, that's the term for it, rescued from the waters. It's a daring plot. A world-changing moment. A trust in something bigger. Something that ultimately desires better and more of us. The Hebrew women, the midwives, in their initial disobedience set the stage for this next moment. And while we might be tempted to focus on the baby in the ark, we need to be aware of the women of faith that surrounded it. They persisted, these women, in their own profound and powerful ways. Employees of empire resisted. Mothers impacted by empire resisted. Siblings who were facing powerful separation resisted. And a woman of privilege within the boundaries of the household of empire. We didn't read this part, but it's there. She resisted. Moved by some sort of faith or hope, some connection to something larger than ourselves. All of them faced some sort of consequence, potentially destructive consequence for the choices that they had made. Even Pharaoh's daughter. And all of them enacted God's love and changed the world in their own ways because of the choices they made, seemingly large and seemingly small. The power to control the world is in which finger? What if I were to tell you, in this week, on this day, you could change the world? Would you believe me? Would you scoff? Would you think I'd missed the mark? Change the world. God has empowered and called us to do so. We have a vigorous faith. We have a dangerous hope. We are church today. Thanks be to God. Amen.